The title of today's lesson is Measuring Development, and as a starter activity, I've asked you to explain the advantages of using HDI as a measure of development. This is something you should have looked at in your lesson earlier this week. It's 2 marks, so you're going to need either 2 points or 1 expanded point. So let's have a look at some of the things that you might have included. So hopefully you've all remembered what the Human Development Index is. It's a measure that looks at multiple factors rather than just one. And what it does is it gives us a better overview of what a country is like. It also gives us a better overview of quality of life because it looks at social factors as well as economic. So anything along those lines would have got you 2 marks. And also it measures social factors as well as economic factors such as life expectancy as well as GNI, which is gross national income. So you could even have mentioned the types of things that were used to measure the HDI. Now the first task today is going to be looking at some different measures of development, and we're going to do the first 2 of these together. Now for each one, what I want you to do is I want you to write down what the development indicator is. I then want you to write down what's good about it. And then I want you to write down any limitations of that. Limitations is a word, it's not necessarily something which is negative, but it's something which holds it back. It's something which is not necessarily great about this. And the first one we're going to do together is birth rate. So you can either pause this presentation and go through this a bit more slowly, or make notes as I go through it. So birth rate on a very simple level is the measure of the number of babies born per 1,000 people within a population, and it's measured annually, so per year. In general, if a country has a high birth rate, it tends to mean that country is either an LIC or a NEE, a developing nation. And the reason for this is because it could be that a country has a lack of contraception. So women, for some reason, don't have access to as much contraception as in other places around the world. It could be the case that there is a need for large families. So a family needs children to either work at home or they need to send them out to work to bring in an extra income for the family. Or it could also be related to high levels of infant mortality. Infant mortality is children dying before they reach over the age of 5. So on the other side of this, if a country has a low birth rate, what that tends to mean is that it's a HIC. And this is because women are choosing to maybe have children later in life. So for example, if somebody goes to study at medical college, it might be the case that they're studying plus from leaving school at 18, they might be studying for another 8 years after that to become a qualified doctor, and they probably will wait to have children until after they've done that, and even possibly going into their career. So people might be not having children until they're in their early to mid 30s. It's very common in high income countries for people to have children much later in life, and that often means that it restricts the number of children that people can have. Also, people have access to a lot more contraception, so they can choose when and how many children they want to have. And also, children are expensive. So it might be the case that people are deciding how many children they can afford to have rather than how many children they want to have. Now, obviously, with birth rate, this is not all straightforward. So we need to evaluate birth rate and think about what we've just said. What are some of the limitations with that? So in terms of positives, it's numerical data, so it's very reliable. It's quite easy to collect. Whenever a child is born in the country, it's normally written down and recorded. So, that will give us a really good picture of what life is like, especially for women within a country. However, obviously these things are not always black and white. Doesn't account for countries that have policies around birth control. So in China, it was very famous that they had the one-child policy for a long time. It no longer exists, this policy, but for a long time it did limit families within China to only have one child. Also, we're being very subjective here. We're making assumptions about what people's lives are like based on data, and that's obviously not always accurate. And also, the data itself might not always be accurate. So there are some countries where maybe they're not very good at collecting this data, or some countries are very secretive. So North Korea is a good example of where it's very difficult to get accurate data of what's happening inside a country. The next one we're going to look at is death rate. Now, death rate is much more complex. It's not as straightforward as birth rate. It's simple in terms of what it is, so it's the number of people who die per 1,000 people. However, it's much trickier to analyse because it doesn't always give us a clear picture of the level of development in any country without using other statistics as well to help us. So a high death rate can mean very different things within a HIC than within a LIC. So, for example, in a HIC, you quite often get quite high death rates because populations are getting older, they're aging, and in comparison to other age groups, that's quite a high percentage of the population, and so that means you're going to see a big increase in death rate. However, in low-income countries, you might get a high death rate because you've got things such as diseases, natural disasters, or warfare, and that death rate is spread across much greater range of age groups. So it might be more useful to look at something like life expectancy rather than looking at death rate. So I'm handing over to you now. I'd like you to look at page 196, and you're going to have a look at infant mortality, doctors per 1,000, literacy rate, and access to clean water. Task 2 today is going to be comparing quality of life, and you're going to need some graph paper to do this. You're going to use the data that's on the table, and you're going to create a scatter graph. So you're going to be using two sets of data. So you need to choose the two that you're going to use. You're then going to plot these onto a graph, draw a line of best fit, and analyse what you found. Now, as an example here, what I've got is, you can see I've drawn my two axes, and I've picked percentage of population with access to clean drinking water, and I've picked literacy rate. Now, the reason I picked these two is because it's nice and easy, because the numbers go from 0 to 100 for both. However, obviously, if you're going to look at GNI, you'd need to think a little bit more carefully about how you're going to draw your axes, because that goes up to $55,000. So that would be a little trickier. Once you've decided on the data that you're going to use and you've drawn your two axes, you're then going to start plotting the data on. So you'll need to look at the information. So if I look at USA, they've got a literacy rate of 99% and a percentage of population with access to safe water of 99%. So I'd find where they both are and draw an X where they meet. So on this graph here, the USA would be really high up. So they'd be almost at the top there, 99, and also near the top there, 99. You then plot on all the rest of your data and you'll start getting a spread of data, a scatter graph as such. To draw a line of best fit on this, you need to put the line where it's dividing between the number of different X's that you can see on there. Now here I've got 8, so my line is going to try and go between it to split it, so I've got 4 on each side. So my line of best fit would look like this. And what this tells me is that I've got a positive correlation. So there is definite link there between the percentage of population with access to clean drinking water and literacy rate. So what I would draw from that is this. I'd say this shows a positive correlation. This means that as the percentage of people in a country with access to clean drinking water increases, so does literacy rate. But I need to explain that then. So this is what I want you to do. You're going to write about what your correlation is. Is it positive? Is it negative? Or is it flat? And then you need to explain why. And also I'd like you to pick out any anomalies. So on this graph here, my anomaly could be this X, because they've got a really high access to drinking clean water, but actually their literacy rate is not particularly high. So that could be a bit of an anomaly that I might pick out. You're going to explain why the relationship is there. So it's fairly obvious, isn't it? If you've got a country that has a high percentage of population with access to clean drinking water, it's probably going to be quite a wealthy country. And you need to think about, well, how does that then link into the reason why I've got such a high literacy rate and such a high number of people who can read and write. Once you've finished that, you need to stick your graph in and make sure all your work is neatly presented together.